Hello and welcome back, everybody out there in Union Arena Land. Today we are joined by Carryion, who was fourth place, one of the top performing decks at GenCon Regionals 2025. Carryion, hello. Thank you very much for doing this with us today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to expand.
Awesome. So, you were one of the 7 people in top 16 playing one of the two best decks that I was calling for coming out of FMA, Roy Rizza Mustang, or as I call it, the Roy Riz deck. Because let's be honest, nobody has more Riz than him in the entire show. But yes, so you were one of the people who managed to take this deck, show off exactly how well it performs, and exactly why knowing matchups is so incredibly important. Can you walk us through your logic behind choosing this specific deck for your Gen Con regionals?
Yeah, for sure. So leading up to the event, I'd say probably 2 to 3 weeks prior, there were a lot of showings of specifically Purple Code Gias, Gawain Gurren, and Squad Zero Ichigo performing very well. And so we had to find a deck, or I wanted to find a deck specifically that could target those two specifically and try to generate a little bit of hate for those two decks.
Mhm.
Um, One of the main keys for Squad Zero was, can I match the removal? And then one of the keys for Gurren is, can I slam enough bodies at the front for it not to matter when they decide to play something impactful?
Mhm.
Um, I found through a lot of testing that, to answer the first question there with regards to can I match Squad Zero's removal, this deck really, really, really does well. Having that automated removal off Roy on every attack is something that I think is unique to this deck. So this really did end up just being a no-brainer. And then for Purple Gawain, that one's a bit of a toss-up here, but I was willing to take a 50-50 into what many consider to be the ubiquitous contender for the deck. So I was really happy to take Blue Mustang to it.
Awesome. So, how long have you been testing this list? Were you looking at all the JP lists coming out and moving around with it back 2 months ago, or were you one of the people who picked it up 2 weeks ago and then, hey, look at that, you found your best deck?
Yeah, so I picked this up around a month ago, so about halfway
Mhm.
between. And a lot of the testing kind of boiled down to what version of the JP list did I find most adequate to play. There were some being thrown around where it was like 8-0 cost and 8-1 cost. There was some where it's more similar to mine where there's a lot more zeros and ones. I just found that this deck really performs well for consistency, and as long as you get to play the game and you play safe, for the most part, you're doing really well. So uh, after testing for, I want to say, like 3-ish weeks more extensively, I found this to be the list I wanted to land on.
Awesome. So, you decided to go with the 11-7 package. When I look at decks, I fundamentally like to build them under the logic of you need a minimum of 10 zeros and 15 zero and ones. That's how you have the least amount of bricks. The 11-7 split. Now, to me, this seems a lot more safe than what I was doing. I was doing the 10-7 split. Can you walk through your logic of choosing why you wanted so much more consistency on the zero spot over having, say, one additional threat, like an Edward or something?
Yeah, so two things. The first was that Roy as a deck, I find, is fundamentally very efficient. And what that means is you get so much value out of each AP that you use in this deck. Um, with that in mind, at the higher end, you see a lot of removal, you see a lot of BP decrease. So for the most part, you have that offensive threat already. I found that if you were more concerned about just playing the game, you always had lines, albeit maybe a little bit harder, but you always had lines in the end game to close out games. And so I wanted to really focus on, hey, I'm going to get the perfect curve in my hand, even if I start with, let's say, 2 zeros and a whole bunch of threes. I'm happy to mulligan it and be pretty confident that I don't brick on that mulligan. I do really think that this deck needs a good curve, and having the 11 zeros and the 7 ones accentuates the fact that you will not brick throughout the game.
Okay, so you wanted to be more consistent on the low end and to be able to aggressively mulligan for those better curve style decks. And
Yeah.
clearly it was rewarding to you. I see that you aren't running any of those eds. Now, I do have to bring up first place had two eds in his pile. I think he was down on two Mustangs, or he was down one of the one drop Rizzes and one of the two drop Mustangs from your list in order to make room for those cards. Looking back on the tournament, do you think you would have ran that ed at all, or are you really happy with this list overall?
I actually did do some testing with the Ed, and I found two things. One, having extra 4Ks really helped in the Gawain Gurren matchup, so the Ed was actually a viable contender. But I think the second point is more along the lines of what do you take out? And as you mentioned, they took out the one cost Riza and the two cost Roy. I found that the value generated from the lower end of the cards in this deck is just too high to warrant having another 4K when you already have cards like Maze Hughes, where you can discard one card from hand and just make it a 4K anyways. Um, if you generate the threat naturally through card effects, I don't think you need raw bodies more often than not, especially if you're playing a more safe, conservative playstyle.
Awesome. Okay, that makes sense. I am going to be testing with both of the lists. Actually, I'm going to be testing with all variants of the list, just to see how they perform more in a local setting, online and stuff like Rumble Rama that I do. Now,
Mhm.
I want to point out some things that you have differently than I have for my list. In my original testing, I did not like the four drop Roy whatsoever. I had zero copies of him in my list. I ended up playing three Eds and one Armstrong, or two Eds and Armstrong, and then the this military sucks. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Event card
Mhm.
as a one of. Can you touch on at least the Armstrong? Why did you not want him in this deck? I mean, clearly the card is like overtuned with everything about it. Like, what was your logic behind not putting that into the deck?
Just to clarify here, we're talking about the Armstrong that's a 5K, I believe.
The 5.2 4.5K. Yeah.
Yes, 5.2, 4.5K. Yeah. So first off, 4.5K, great breakpoint. Anything above a 4K breakpoint naturally is a really, really solid card. I
Hmm.
think for me, what I cared most about with the deck was draw power. So if we look back at the history for blue UA up until this point, we see that blue has a lot of draw. And typically, most decks that existed for blue weren't able to capitalize on that. But with this deck, considering your Roy's removal is directly tied to how many cards you have in hand, I thought that the draw power would come in extremely useful. The 4/1 Roy Mustang, for those who don't know, if you have no cards in hand when it's attacking, you get to draw a card. That might not sound like a big deal, but there are a lot of cases where A, you need to remove chump blockers, or B, you want to start your next turn with a card in hand after having just dumped your hand. And so I found that the only consistent way to keep your hand advantage going and thereby creating constant threat off the Roy was to make sure you always had at least one card in hand. Um, that being said, there are benefits to having the Armstrong. I just found that in testing, especially for the matchups I wanted to target, having the 4/1 Mustang felt a lot more natural and easier to actually hit the 4K breakpoint when it came to swinging with Roy, the 5/1 Raid Roy.
Yeah, yeah. Being able to kill something more consistently with that other card. Okay.
Exactly.
I understand the logic. It makes sense. Absolutely. I think I need to start playing with that Roy more because when I first looked at him, I was like, he's a 5K attacker. Okay, Sukuna. Like, I wasn't really that impressed with it, you know? And then the
Yeah,
more people talk about it, I was like, okay, that draw a card actually matters. I get it. Like, uh,
yeah, yeah.
so originally, when people are looking at this deck, they look at it and they go, wow, you have to discard your hand to kill things. That sucks. Because nobody likes discarding cards. Let's be honest, you don't like to do it. We're card gamers. We like when a card says draw a card, not discard a card. That annoys
Mhm.
us. Um, did you ever run into situations where you weren't discarding even though there was a threat that you could remove? Or did you run into situations where you're like, because I killed something last turn, I have nothing to do this turn? Like, did you ever have a bricked up moment where like you couldn't do something because of the void discarding too many cards to remove something?
Usually, no. There were some very, very niche situations in testing I found, but in the tournament, there was no scenario where I was bricked out of the hand. And I think to touch on the previous point, the 4/1 Mustang, non-raid Mustang was a big part of that. I think also the playstyle that I adopted made it very difficult for ever having nothing in hand to brick with. I think fundamentally people try to play this deck a little too aggressively, and I don't think that's correct. And if you play it conservatively, more often than not, your hand is still relatively healthy until the very end of the game. And so I usually played a style where I almost never dumped the cards out of my hand. In fact, I think of the entire tournament, I only had 4 games where my hand was ever empty.
Wow.
The reason being, of course, that you generate card advantage, but obviously having impact is really good for Roy. So if you need to close out, you need to close out. But to answer your question, no, I don't think I ever had problems with having cards in hand.
All right. So, are you familiar with the skill floor, skill ceiling analogy used in a lot of TCGs?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Where would you rank this skill floor? Saying like 0 is the base entry, you walk in, this is a Sukuna deck, like, okay, you can win with it. And the ceiling being, I don't know, what in this green Saitama. Like, you really need to be good with it for it to be good. Um,
Yeah,
where would you rank
uh,
that?
yeah, it's hard to say. I think I would probably lean this toward the higher skill ceiling decks. I certainly wouldn't put it as high as extreme management decks like Green Saitama. I do think the resource management being your hand is a little scary for a lot of players. Like you mentioned, we're card players. We like having cards in hand. Having 0 cards in hand feels just wrong in our
I need
minds.
something to flick. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But generally speaking, I would say this is a relatively difficult deck to pilot. I think knowing when to go on the aggressive in particular is the hardest thing for people to wrap their heads around, especially when UA is like such a young game. People want to just see a card, play card, smash into them, right?
There's a reason
Um,
Renji rushes a deck. Yeah.
exactly, right. And some decks are built for that, but I don't think this deck is. And so once people wrap their head around the concept that, oh, you don't have to play everything in hand, they'll start understanding the deck a little more. So I'd probably rate this like upper skill ceiling, but not the top tier.
Okay. So, do you think it has a high barrier entry though for anybody who wants to pick up the deck and start playing?
Yes, I would say that if you're first coming into UA as a new player, there's a couple fallacies in the game that already exist that people don't really understand until they've played a good number of games. One of which is being do not aggress for no reason. And we see this a lot where people will, put up a chump attacker and just smack you for 1 life. And more often than not, that's actually not even correct. But people do it because, taking 1 life feels good. You get the
Yeah.
immediate gratification and you feel like you're, progressing to an end game. Uh, I think if people start to realize that, offense is not always the best offense, as counterintuitive as that sounds, um, people will do better. But because of how unintuitive that sounds, I think the barrier to entry mentally is a little higher than most other decks.
Hey, very interesting. So, moving along past this, can we go over your matchups? What decks did you play against as you were ranking up until you made it over to the top table?
Yeah, so I actually pulled out my notepad for this. I wrote down all my matchups for the day.
Thank you very much.
Yes, of course. So I will say this is probably the broadest spectrum of matchups I've ever witnessed.
Oh, that's so
Every
good.
single every single person I have talked to, they've never seen matchups like mine for an entire tournament. That's not even just being restrictive to UA, so it's kind of interesting. Um, we expected a lot of Purple Gur and Gawain, and we expected a lot of Squad Zero. I did not hit a single Purple Gur and Gawain, and I only saw one Squad Zero.
Oh,
So it was very, very strange. The rest of the matchups go as follows. So I saw blue Kirito Asuna, so blue Sword Art, yellow Tanjiro Nezuko, green Sinon, blue Sukuna, so Yuji Sukuna there, purple Toto, and green Toshi at the very end.
oh, your last matchup was Green Toshi?
Yeah, surprisingly, yes, and I believe it was the
Wow.
top 16 list
Yeah.
that was the person I was up against.
Oh, fantastic. And did any of those feel rough for you to play against? Did any of those feel like, okay, this is the deck that I should have tech differently for if you were anticipating playing against it? Or any of those feel like, okay, this is a bad matchup, you just got lucky?
I think green Sinon was kind of interesting. Obviously, my lack of experience with that matchup played a factor into it as well. But there's something to be said for a deck that has natural 5Ks. and had that player been able to more consistently raid the 7 cost Kirito, I think I would have been in trouble. That would have been a difficult matchup. Purple Toto as well is a bit of a dice roll for this deck. If they really time their switches well, and if I don't have the appropriate setup, that deck can really do a number on me. Uh, I believe I played a player named Creamy who was able to turn 3, take 4 life, and I was just sitting there like dumbfounded. I don't know what to do at this scenario, and luckily I had the outs, but uh, if I didn't have it, I was probably just getting steamrolled. So that was also a difficult one.
Double damage is terrifying. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay, so do you think there's anything you would do differently or any build differences that you would make after experiencing this tournament if you were to say like in 2 weeks have another gen con, another regional that you had to go into? Is there a swap that you would make, or would you still stick with this deck even though people are going to become more experienced against it?
So one swap I actually would make, and I immediately made it after the tournament actually, was switching the 1 cost Riza count to 3 and including one more 1 cost Roy Mustang. A lot of people are not going to be happy to hear that because the Roy Mustang is kind of locked behind starter decks, but I
Yeah.
do think having 4 null impacts is really important in this deck. Uh,
Mm.
Even though the 4K bodies are a big deal, just the sheer number of impact decks in the current meta makes it so you lose life pretty consistently in the early game, and any chip damage actually makes it really hard to play the game. So if you can mitigate that to the best of your ability, that's usually a really good sign that you can win the game. So I'd probably make that switch, just switch the counts from 3-4 to 4-3. Outside of that, I don't think I'd make any changes.
Really? Wow. So you would go down to 10 zeros, 8 ones then.
Oh no, I sorry, 11 zeros, and it would be 7 ones, but I would be switching the 1 cost Riza with the 1 cost Roy, so it'd be a
Okay, the
4-3
one.
switch.
Okay, okay. I heard the 0 cost. I was like, okay, that's interesting. Because that's closer to what I run is the 10 and 7. But
Right.
yeah, that makes a lot more sense then. So lose out on the number of scries that you get to do with Riza in order to have that better nullify impact. Now, one thing I do want to touch on, because it's only come up for me a couple of times in all of the games that I've had with it so far, that one drop Roy being a 3K with no cards in hand, has there ever been a situation for you where you've been able to smash into your opponent with 3Ks because Riz is just minusing 1K their 4Ks? Has that come up to you yet? Like at all?
Yeah, I would say way too frequently, frankly. There are a lot of
Really?
cases too where the 2 cost Roy dropping 1k BP is actually very relevant, even with chump blocker fighting. So,
Mm.
for example, there was a match I had against the Squad Zero where at some point I just slammed down the 2 cost Roy Mustang. That was the only card in hand, which let the 1 cost Roy Mustang actually go over a 4k because I went minus 1k on them. Roy goes plus 1k, and I can take a life. Uh, it happens. It's not frequent, I'll give you that, but just the ability to manipulate battle power in this game is extremely relevant, and so I think uh, it's a really useful thing to look out for, and this deck does it in spades. So it does come up. It's just I wouldn't say it's nearly as frequent as most people would probably think.
Okay. Yeah, it's only come up for me like twice so far where I was like, okay, well, minus 1K there, minus 1K there. Hey, I can attack now.
Yeah,
But like, because that was one of the appeals originally to me in the deck, because like, obviously, Roy is a must kill, right? Raid Roy, if he comes down, you don't let him sit on the field. That's the number one tip I've given everybody if you're playing against Roy. Kill it now, kill it with fire. It doesn't matter what it costs you, get rid of it. Because every turn it's in play, it is better than the 5 drop Asta. Like, honestly, it's so insane. Um, but because of that, you really do have that openness to be able to go, okay, well, minus 1K here. Now you don't have good blocks with all my other guys. Rizza wasn't killed, so she's still just a value engine. Really, really good card. Now, the last thing I want to know is there any tips you would give to somebody if they are picking up this deck for the first time?
yeah. The number one tip that I would give, not just to people who play this deck, but for anyone who plays a reactive deck, so this would technically apply to Gur and Gawain as well. Really take your time with understanding when you have to use resources. There's so many games where people will look at their hand and think, "Oh, I have Riza and Mustang raid. I can do that now. I'm gonna flood my board." And when they take a step back and think about it, you'll realize, "Oh, I could have achieved the exact same thing if I just pushed 2 chump blockers up and put down the 2-cost Roy Mustang." And so if you really think about what the value is out of each card that you're playing and you really try to digest, oh, I don't need to aggress now. I can just use what I have with my chump blockers. You actually get a lot more value of this deck. In fact, I would almost always say if you don't have to raid Roy, do not raid Roy. That's one of the biggest problems with this deck is if Roy doesn't stick on the board for more than one turn, you are looking at a potential loss. You need to make sure the opponent uses their resources first, and then you can play your Roy. So please just take it slow, don't aggress, and if you need to, really make sure you're going all out and that you can set up a really, really solid end game board state. Otherwise, you're probably losing.
Really good tip. Yeah, I might be a little too aggressive when I Roy because I go, ooh, I can kill it, and I just put it down there.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to touch on, and this will be the last thing before we wrap everything up. It's already happening. I'm sure you anticipated this happening after seeing 7 of the top 16 decks were Roy. People are trying to discredit this deck, saying it's because nobody was practiced against it. It's because people don't know its matchups. I've even seen some people speak out already and say in 2 weeks' time, this deck is going to be an X3 drop from an event like this because people will know the matchups. How do you feel on that? And do you think that this deck really performed this well because of its surprise factor, or do you think this is actually a contender for tier 1 deck in our meta?
Great question. Yeah, I've also seen a lot of people say, this deck only performed well because we had 2 weeks to prep for it, and it wasn't fair that this IP was allowed to be played in a regional with such little preparation. And to some extent, that is true. I do think that uh, Blue Mustang coming out onto the field in its first large-scale event, being a regional, really helped with the fact that a lot of people who maybe didn't have access to the cards or who maybe didn't have access to someone who knew the effects ahead of time uh, would do well. That being said, I think this deck is still a very solid contender in the current meta. It's near impossible to say that the value out of removing a body off of an attack is bad. For those who want to see a similar example, there aren't very many. Look at Green Saitama. If he's punching you and he removes a body, you feel terrible. That happens with this deck very frequently. So it's still a really solid deck. Do I agree with the idea that it's an X3 drop deck in 2 weeks? No. But there is something to be said for a surprise factor. And I will say, if people know how to play against this deck over time, we would probably see a lot less consistent success with it unless the player really understood the deck.
Okay, so do you think that assuming everybody has like 100 games deep on all of their decks, this would still be a tier 1 status as it currently is now? Or do you think in a few more weeks this might be dropping down a little bit lower?
I would probably still put it tier 1, at absolute worst, tier 1.5. I think, granted, if everyone has 100 games on every deck, you should be able to know how to play every deck to the point where you could, top 16 a regional pretty easily. But I do think that of the decks that currently exist in the meta, this is certainly a top tier one. I'd probably put it top 5, is my
Top,
guess.
top 5. Wow, nice. Yeah, that's around where I ranked it as well. So awesome.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so incredibly much for joining us today. Would you like to shout out anybody?
Yeah, so a couple shout outs. Shout out to Haven, the group up north in Canada that really helped out, and we played together all weekend. Div actually made top 8 as well, so Haven teammate there. Shout out to my boys in the north who have always played other TCGs with me, so the Bong Bong crew. And lastly, shout out to my girlfriend out in Vancouver who has always supported me through all of these degenerate endeavors.
Oh, fantastic. And thank you very much for joining us. Yeah, shout out to everybody. We'll make sure we have a link to Haven down in the description below. And thank you very much. We'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.